All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories, number 85, part 2. Matthias Baldwin, 1795-1866. Taking Pleasure in Perfection. Picture a boy growing up in the early 1800s in New Jersey. Pockets are brimming with handmade wooden toys. His head is teeming with creative ideas. This boy is Matthias William Baldwin, whose inventive spirit in childhood paved the way for his future impact on American industry. Born December 10th, 1795 in Elizabethtown, New Jersey, Matthias was raised in a home where faith and perseverance were guiding principles. His father, William Baldwin, was a well-regarded carriage maker and a devoted member of the Presbyterian Church. But when Matthias was just 4 years old, his father died, leaving the family's finances vulnerable to dishonest caretakers. And soon Matthias's mother was left to provide for 5 children, relying solely on her strength and ingenuity. Matthias found in these hardships the seeds of resourcefulness and self-reliance, the traits that would come to define his life. His mother, a woman of uncommon resolve, held the family together through unyielding effort. She personally oversaw her children's education and instilled in Matthias an enduring work ethic and resilience that would shape his future. Now, unlike most inventors or scholars, Matthias wasn't really into books. Instead, he was way more interested in figuring out how things work. As a kid, he'd take apart every toy he got just to see what made it tick. And he left the house full of shavings and bits and pieces from his endless experiments. If he wasn't helping his mother, you'd find him dreaming up new tools or gadgets, always building, tinkering, or fixing something, never just sitting around. Though stories from his youth are scarce, one in particular highlights his steadfast honesty, a trait that would remain with him for life. One afternoon on his way home from school, Matthias and a friend each picked up a pine shingle from a nearby building site, lured by the chance to create something new. But when Matthias's mother learned of this, she impressed upon him the importance of integrity even in the smallest matters. And moved by a sense of guilt, Matthias returned the shingle and apologized, a lesson in honor that he carried forward always. Through these formative experiences, Matthias Baldwin emerged as more than a skilled mechanic. He became a young man guided by integrity, passion, and perseverance. His early life shaped not just his future achievements, but the unwavering values that would guide him from a humble workshop to a place at the forefront of American innovation. Eventually, Matthias's fascination with mechanical tools became more than a hobby. It was time to put his talents to practical use. Eager to relieve his mother from supporting him and determined to master a useful trade, Matthias set out to learn a mechanical craft. From the beginning, even the smallest toys that he built stood out for their quality and their precision. Matthias was never satisfied with something roughly made. He sought out the finest materials and painstakingly polished every surface. He would study the inner workings of a watch for hours, trying to unravel its complex design. Driven by this passion and a timely opportunity, Matthias's first job was decided for him. At 16, he began an apprenticeship with the Woolworth brothers in Frankfort, Philadelphia County, where he learned the jeweler's art. And during his 5-year apprenticeship, Matthias quietly honed his skills away from public attention, but steadily building the foundation for his later accomplishments. He lived with one of his employers, was welcomed by respected families in the area, and formed friendships that he cherished throughout his life. Among his peers, Matthias was known for his refusal to drink alcohol, a resolve shaped by witnessing the effects of intemperance in a relative. From early on, he committed himself to total abstinence, a principle he maintained always. It was also during this period that his love for music blossomed, and his greatest joy was found in the gatherings of the small Presbyterian church, where he joined others in singing sacred songs. While Matthias continued his work, his mother moved the family to Philadelphia. In early 1817, Matthias joined Fletcher and Gardner, jewelers at 130 Chestnut Street. The firm depended greatly on trustworthy workers, and Baldwin soon proved himself indispensable. He brought thought, care, and creativity to his work. He was never content with mere repetition. Orders that required innovation and taste were quickly entrusted to him, for he was known to take genuine pleasure in making a perfect thing. Matthias approached his work with enthusiasm, even when others saw it as routine. His dedication quickly earned him the respect of his employers, while his genial nature won him the friendship of his co-workers. Though quiet, he was always cheerful and independent, steadfast in doing what he believed was right, no matter the opinions of those around him. Those who knew him well noticed early on the qualities that would later define his character, especially his unwavering resolve, which sometimes bordered on stubbornness. He had a habit, sometimes exasperating to friends, of quietly pursuing what he believed was right, unmoved by their objections. In time it became clear that once Matthias made up his mind, further argument was pointless, a trait that was tested more than once in those years. On one occasion, he was using a tool that a co-worker claimed belonged to him and tried to take away. Matthias calmly examined it and declared, "That tool is mine." What followed was a one-sided debate as the other man insisted the tool was his, but Matthias remained silent, focused on his work. Only when the co-worker tried to take the tool did Matthias firmly stand his ground, putting an end to any further attempts to take advantage of him. Matthias worked as a journeyman for 2 years, earning wages that were considered generous at the time. His days were carefree and full of hope for the future. He often recalled those early years with fondness, finding joy in both the beauty of the objects he crafted and the art he admired on his daily walks. In the evenings, he would relax by the fire, his conscience clear, dreaming of the day when he could fill his own home with beautiful things and provide fellow craftsmen with more to aspire to than gazing into shop windows. In time, Matthias Baldwin would not only dream noble things, he would achieve them. Through careful spending, support from his family, and some extra capital, he began to make decorative jewelry on a small scale in 1819. His honesty and talent quickly won customers, and his initial success was promising. These opportunities allowed him to pursue original ideas, and just as he seemed on the verge of fulfilling his ambitions, demand for jewelry declined sharply with the financial panic of 1819 to 1821. Even his excellent craftsmanship could not attract buyers, and this halted his career just as it began after years of hard preparation. Yet, this turn of events led him toward greater work. His apprenticeship and 4 years in the jewelry business were invaluable and shaped the skills that served him well. This background showed in 2 major aspects of his work as a machinist: the exceptional precision and finish of everything he made, skills refined during his time working with fine metals, and an inventive drive inspired but also tempered by his jewelry work. Remarkably, despite his great creativity, he rarely wasted time on impractical inventions. While others filled the patent office with ambitious but misguided ideas, Baldwin, though lacking formal scientific education, relied on the thorough training of his craft and practical knowledge of materials. This balance gave him both wisdom and boldness. His inventions from this period, including a new gold plating process which he never patented, demonstrate his ingenuity. Instead of using gold leaf, He fused a thicker gold piece into base metal and rolled them together until they reached the desired thinness. His passion for his craft persisted beyond youthful enthusiasm, providing motivation and joy throughout his life. Creativity and originality fueled him, lifting his work above mere routine and turning him into more than just a craftsman. Matthias Baldwin became an artist. He found himself ready for more meaningful work, just as jewelry making stopped being profitable. While declining sales, successful experiments with steel, and his adventurous spirit played roles in his shift, the deciding factor was conscience. In a rare personal revelation, he explained why he moved away from jewelry. One night, reflecting on how he would account for his life's work, he decided he could not justify spending his life creating trivial ornaments. Just as he was searching for a more meaningful path that fit his conscience, passions, and business needs, the new opportunity opened for him. Matthias had often crossed paths with David Mason, a machinist who is now working in wood engraving and had built strong relationships with the city's book publishers. Mason noticed that all their tools and machines for bookbinding were imported from abroad, so he decided to make these products locally, and he invited Baldwin to join him in the venture. They launched their business in early 1825 by sending out circulars. Orders rolled in so quickly that both men left their previous jobs to focus on their new enterprise. Their shop, tucked away on a narrow street behind Walnut between 4th and 5th, began manufacturing machines for binding, including hydraulic presses. And thanks to their bold approach, the United States book industry became independent from foreign suppliers and gained important innovations. Their workshop produced intricate and eye-catching designs for stamping gold lettering on book covers and spines. The days of dull library shelves were replaced by beautiful decorations, wreaths, rosettes, leaves framing book titles. The Reverend Albert Barnes, who's buried in the south section of Laurel Hill East, treasured a small stamp from Baldwin featuring the word Bible, surrounded by delicate vines, a testament to Baldwin's refined and thoughtful designs. They soon expanded into making cylinders for printing calico fabrics. Instead of using flat blocks, they engraved patterns onto rollers, allowing entire pieces of muslin to move through the press in one smooth motion. They experimented with different techniques to cut down on the manual labor involved, like etching and punching designs into copper. Ultimately, their best tool was a small roller called a mill, and once the design was engraved onto its surface, it could be transferred to the larger cylinder simply by rolling it. And yet, Baldwin still wasn't satisfied. He wanted to further reduce the manual work in preparing these mills. Now, he had previously worked with dies for printing banknotes and managed to replicate a die onto another piece of steel using only pressure. The original die was pressed into soft steel, which was then hardened and pressed again to recreate the design with precision. This technique was Baldwin's own innovation. He never patented it or pursued banknote engraving, but he applied it to making copper cylinders for calico printing, a breakthrough on par with stereotyping in the world of printing. The old method for making mills involved punches, driving them into the roller, raising the metal, finishing the details with a graver. This process was so labor-intensive that sometimes the whole design was carved by hand. Baldwin and Mason's improvement was to etch the design into the steel mill. They coated the steel with varnish, traced the pattern, and immersed it in a specially prepared acid, achieving etching on steel that was just as crisp as on copper. With just a few finishing touches from a graver, the device was ready. No more manual work was needed for the entire copper cylinder. The hardened mill was rolled with great pressure onto another steel cylinder of the same size, creating a perfect relief of the design. This second cylinder was hardened and then rolled onto the big copper printing cylinder. With every revolution, the design was transferred precisely onto the fabric, and the process could be repeated as needed until the cylinder was ready for production without any handwork from an engraver. The dies were preserved, allowing the plates to be reproduced endlessly with flawless accuracy. Engraving has come a long way since then, and Baldwin's later achievements outshined this early success. But it's worth remembering the skepticism he faced and the astonishment when it worked. This innovation completely transformed a rising manufacturing industry and marked the start of Baldwin's own prosperity. He often made $30 in a single sitting working on a mill, overcoming new challenges as they arose. Soon he was making cylinders for printing in 3 colors, assembling them in frames, and building complete machines for this complex process. $30 in a single sitting is impressive, considering as a skilled workman might make $1 or even $1.25 a day. Mason and Baldwin was incredibly successful. Their production of printing rollers boosted their business so much that their tiny workshop in Bank Coffee House Alley couldn't keep up with the demand. Success pushed them to expand to a larger space. By early 1828, they had moved to Minor Street, planning to keep up the same line of work. Minor Street ran intermittently between Walnut and Chestnut from 8th to 13th. Nowadays, most of Minor Street is known as Sansom Street. It was this move that set the stage for Mr. Baldwin to embark on his biggest project yet. With the new shop came higher expectations, and the old hand machines and foot-powered lathes just didn't cut it anymore. They tried using horsepower, literally horses, but that wasn't enough either. Eventually, they invested in a steam engine, the best available at the time. But Baldwin wasn't satisfied with how it ran, so after a few attempts to improve it, he decided to design and build his own engine from scratch. He created a compact, upright engine, about 5 horsepower, that only took up 6 square feet. Every part fit perfectly, which made the engine run so quietly that you couldn't even hear it working. This little powerhouse stood near the shop's entrance, hidden from view when the door opened. Visitors, seeing and hearing nothing, often wonder where all the energy was coming from. The boiler sat just below, next to the blacksmith's forge, where it always had fuel. Amazingly, this engine was still running almost 40 years later, powering the entire boiler shop at the Broad Street factory. After Mr. Baldwin's death, a friend with a fondness for antiques visited the old engine and asked the engineer why they didn't give it some rest to help it last longer. The engineer replied, "I used to ask Mr. Baldwin to lighten our load, but he always said he wanted to do as much work as possible while he was alive and expected the same from his machines." End quote. Baldwin's engine was not only more refined and powerful than others of its time, it also featured an innovative design that would prove crucial to marine engineering. To turn the piston's up and down motion into a spinning movement, you need a connecting rod attached to the crank of the flywheel. Traditionally, this setup required a lot of space. Baldwin, however, set the cylinder upright and attached the piston to a special frame, much like a sawmill's gate, so it moved up and down in a compact space with an outside gate translating that motion to the crank. His invention compressed the entire mechanism into half the usual space, a breakthrough that laid the foundation for the massive engines eventually used in steamships. The second engine Baldwin built went to the American Sunday School Union. This 5-horsepower machine likely printed the first Christian children's books in America ever produced by steam power. Baldwin later became a Sunday school superintendent and helped build many mission chapels. But his first big contribution was giving children thousands of beautiful books. Before long, making stationary engines became the shop's main business. As their engines got more powerful, demand grew. Competitors started to take notice. One day, a stranger with strong references visited Baldwin and admitted that he planned to start a competing business. He asked Baldwin where he sourced his iron, who made his boilers, since Baldwin's engines were known for their superior materials and workmanship. Without hesitation, Baldwin shared his suppliers, saying, "There's room enough for both of us." Well, the company grew so quickly that one of his partners, cautious by nature, got nervous and left the firm a year or two after they bought the Minor Street property. But Baldwin had earned such trust from his workers that everyone stayed with him, and the work continued seamlessly. Looking back over those 10 years offers plenty of lessons for ambitious young people. Baldwin went from a hard-working apprentice to a journeyman, then to an independent manufacturer. He invented machines that multiplied labor capacity tenfold, introduced new products that boosted the country's economy, and helped found an institution that would shape future generations. And within just 10 years, he became one of America's leading manufacturers of stationary steam engines, with plenty of life still ahead of him. The first steam-powered locomotives to arrive in the United States came from England, thanks to Horatio Allen of New York, who brought them over in late 1829 or early 1830. One was assembled on the Delaware and Hudson Railroad in Carbondale, Pennsylvania, but it proved too heavy for the tracks and was soon set aside. A year later, the fall of 1830, the Camden and Amboy Railroad Company announced they had imported a locomotive. They kept this engine hidden away in a warehouse near Philadelphia to shield it from prying eyes. But that didn't stop Mr. Baldwin. He made his way over with a friend and managed to convince the man in charge to just let him see the machine. Baldwin inspected every part. He took some quick measurements and notes, and he even crawled underneath the massive boiler, studying it with intense focus for nearly half an hour. When he emerged, his enthusiasm was obvious. He turned to his companion, Franklin Peale, the manager of the Philadelphia Museum, who'd already asked him for a working model, and declared, "I can make it." Franklin Peale was, of course, one of the several sons of portraitist Charles Willson Peale. Now, armed with only his notes from his hasty examination and what he could find in scientific journals, Baldwin built a miniature locomotive, and on April 25, 1831, he placed this working model on a circular track inside the Philadelphia Museum, and he soon had drawn crowds of fascinated onlookers. This success inspired Matthias to tackle a bigger problem, designing an improved locomotive for American railroads, which had so far relied on a handful of clunky, hard-to-manage machines. Early in 1832, the Philadelphia and Germantown Railroad Company ordered a small locomotive from him. Baldwin dropped the single upright cylinder and introduced a series of permanent improvements. His designs were so original, it was as if he'd never seen another engine. He focused especially on generating and conserving steam. Building this pioneering American locomotive took about 6 months, and it wasn't easy. Baldwin faced plenty of obstacles, including not even having a proper space for heavy forging. The only blacksmith shop was in the factory's cellar, so the largest parts had to be made elsewhere. In the middle of the project, Baldwin moved his operation to a new building in Lodge Alley without missing a day of work, pushing ahead nonstop until everything was ready for the grand test, November 23, 1832. And on the very next day, the United States Gazette wrote, "A most gratifying experiment was made yesterday afternoon on the Philadelphia, Germantown, and Norristown Railroad. The beautiful locomotive engine and tender, built by M.W. Baldwin of this city, whose reputation as an ingenious machinist is well known, were for the first time placed on the road. The engine traveled about 6 miles, working with perfect accuracy and ease in all of its parts and with great velocity. Now, according to this report, Baldwin's locomotive was displayed before several science-minded gentlemen, and after being assembled at Baldwin's factory, it was moved to the company depot. Once the regular passenger cars had cleared the tracks that afternoon, the crew fired up the new engine, and within 20 minutes the fire was burning and the steam was ready. The locomotive set off with its tender in style, running smoothly and steadily. It went half a mile past the Union Tavern at the township line before turning back, covering a total of 6 miles at about 28 miles per hour. Because they slowed at road crossings and it was already dark, the engine didn't even use its full power. The spectators were thrilled. The Philadelphia Chronicle reported, "From this experiment, there is every reason to believe this engine will draw 30 tons gross at an average speed of 40 miles an hour on a level road. The principal superiority of the engine over any English ones we know is its light weight, just 4 to 5 tons, its compact size, and the simplicity of its machinery. We're delighted with the results, as they prove that Philadelphia's skilled mechanics can build steam engines for railroads that combine so many superior qualities. It makes us believe they'll soon supply nearly all such public works across the country." And here's a fun ad from Polson's American Daily Advertiser, November 26, 1832. Notice, "The locomotive engine built by M.W. Baldwin of this city will depart daily when the weather is fair with a train of passenger cars. On rainy days, horses will be attached." The problem with rain was traction. The steel wheels wouldn't grip the rails, so they had to revert to the horse flesh. Success was not immediate. There were no American engineers trained to operate Baldwin's new locomotive. Only one person other than Baldwin knew the machine well enough to drive it, and he got sick just as service began. Other operators tried. They grew frustrated with the complex engine, and the railroad's president was convinced that something was fundamentally wrong. He threatened to reject the machine altogether. But fortunately, the original engineer recovered, repaired the machinery, and kept the locomotive running until it finally met everyone's expectations. Newspapers of the day made bold claims. Some said the engine, named Ironsides, covered a mile in just 57 seconds, topping 70 miles an hour. Eyewitnesses debated the numbers for years afterwards. Ironsides wasn't perfect. It needed changes and improvements. But for a first attempt, it was a remarkable achievement, better suited to its purpose than any other American engine of its time. Yet Baldwin felt deeply discouraged by the criticism his creation received. In spring 1833, after getting paid $3,500 for the locomotive, $500 less than the contract, he told an apprentice, "That is our last locomotive." The irony wasn't lost on anyone when years later the same apprentice, now an officer at the factory, spotted engine number 1500 being built at the time of Baldwin's death. Meanwhile, other inventors entered the scene. The same railroad company bought another engine from the West Point foundry in April 1833, and the Daily Chronicle praised a locomotive named Pennsylvania, built by Colonel Long of the U.S. Army, that was running on the Germantown Road that June. The Franklin Institute Journal also covered that machine. We may never know if competition or Baldwin's personal beliefs affected his business, but what's certain is that he was eager to try again. Nearly 2 years passed before he received another order and decided to give it another go. During this time, Baldwin kept coming up with valuable improvements. He was so eager to put his ideas to work. He would have accepted new projects at a loss. He was that determined to innovate. And it was also in 1833 that Matthias Baldwin was elected to the American Philosophical Society. His next locomotive was a major leap forward from Ironsides and quickly earned him a solid reputation. Gradually, locomotive manufacturing became the focus of Baldwin's shop, eventually making the Lodge Alley factory too small. Moving completed engines out of the building was nearly impossible. So in 1835, after producing 9 or 10 locomotives, Baldwin moved operations to Broad and Hamilton Streets. The new facility was built specifically to concentrate all his resources on building locomotives as efficiently as possible. Despite there being few railroads and even fewer engines in the country, Baldwin's gamble paid off. He kept making stationary engines for a few more years, and in 1837 he took on the massive job of building machinery for Philadelphia's City Ice Boat. He completed that challenging project so well that the engines outlasted their original hull, and 30 years later the engines were transferred to a new hull almost without any repairs. After that, Baldwin focused solely on his beloved locomotives. When Mr. Baldwin started working on locomotives, he had just joined the Christian church. As his innovations brought him more wealth and influence, he dedicated everything to serving God. Many assumed his generosity and charitable acts came from a naturally giving spirit, but Mr. Baldwin always insisted his systematic giving was the result of God's grace. He often said, "I'm more grateful for the desire to give than for the ability. Wealth is easier to gain than the heart to use it well. Without a new heart, my money would have been a curse." Some feel that his faith grew out of a deep sorrow. In February 1833, his home was filled with joy when a healthy son was born, the child of promise after others had died in infancy. Samuel Baldwin thrived, and his character matched his robust health. Mr. Baldwin cherished him deeply. The child was closely tied to Baldwin's growing faith. In the mornings, when Baldwin read the newspaper, his son would climb into his lap, snatch it away, and say, "No, Papa, Bible first." Baldwin felt overwhelming gratitude for this little Samuel, who seemed to hear God's voice even more clearly than he did. And for 2 wonderful years, this affection shaped Baldwin's deepest intentions. But in February 1835, tragedy struck. The child grew restless one night, struggling to breathe with severe croup. Baldwin watched helpless as his son passed away, feeling as though his own light had gone out. Now, retired physician here. This sounds to me more like diphtheria than croup. Croup can be frightening. It causes this brassy, barking cough, but croup rarely leads to respiratory failure and death, unlike diphtheria. After Samuel's death, the house fell silent and dark. Every aspect of his life, work, pleasure, even religion, reminded Baldwin of his lost son. Reading the Bible brought tears, and praying felt empty without the child beside him. Eventually, the family stopped mentioning the loss, overwhelmed by grief. Yet this heartbreak strengthened Baldwin's faith. He emerged from his sorrow more devoted than ever. To honor his son, Matthias Baldwin started a school for local children who lived in poverty. He funded the teachers and gave opportunities his son would never need. He made it his mission never to overlook the little ones, as he called them. This school launched Baldwin's broader work for marginalized communities. Around 1835, he and others supported Pompey Hunt, a gifted black preacher, by raising money to allow Hunt to devote himself fully to gospel work. After an hour of debate, Baldwin spoke up. "I've saved $25 for a new suit, but I could wear my old one. Put me down for $25. This example inspired the group to raise $400, and they were able to hire 2 missionaries instead of 1. Now that moment sparked the Young Men's Missionary Association of the First Church. They distributed tracts and supported workers among the city's neglected population. Baldwin was the driving force, always stepping in when funds were short. He would even sign promissory notes for hundreds of dollars, trusting God to provide. Critics warned him, but Baldwin replied, "If we trust the Lord for our business, why not for his work?" Baldwin's faith fueled his generosity. His consistent example profoundly influenced the church, especially since systematic giving was rare at the time. Some questioned his motives, but they eventually recognized his sincerity. While his later wealth allowed larger gifts, his self-sacrifice during lean years inspired many. It's estimated that even when living modestly, Baldwin donated about $10,000 a year, well more than he could afford, and it sometimes affected his personal and even business finances. But some banks took a supportive view. Quote, "We'll help him because he's determined to do good with his money. His collaterals are God's promises." End quote. Baldwin's organized charitable work has been well documented, but his private acts of kindness were countless. He often gave away all the cash he carried, settling small debts every morning. When asked why he never had any money on him, he'd explain he'd give it all away to missionaries, to buy books, to help a poor child, to help pay a cab ride to the prison. He was grateful that his credit was good because strangers trusted him. But keeping his accounts balanced proved impossible, as forgotten donation checks arrived regularly. Once, when approached by a man requesting contributions, Baldwin didn't even recognize him. He'd given $100 the day before, but there'd been a dozen such requests. Baldwin eventually set a rule. All charity requests must go through his office, not his home. But he sometimes made exceptions. One cold winter night, he gave a shivering man his own coat, brought baskets of food and clothing, and helped a freezing family secure work and comfort. To stay focused and ensure his help reached those truly in need, Baldwin hired a trusted lady from the Society of Friends to visit families and distribute aid. Her stories of his generosity could fill a book. During Baldwin's first decade as a locomotive builder, 1/2 of his total production for that period came in 1836 and 1837. 14 engines had emerged from the shops in 1835, the year Baldwin opened the factory at Broad and Spring Garden, then outside the city limits, out in the countryside. The number leaped to 40 locomotives during each of the next 2 years. By September 1839, the works had constructed 140 engines for 39 railroads. More than 1/3 of this output, however, had been taken by only 3 lines: 27 by the Philadelphia and Columbia Railroad, 12 by the Utica and Schenectady, and 12 by the Georgia Railroad and Banking Company. In December 1838, when Baldwin's total had reached 122, Secretary of the Treasury Levi Woodbury reported that there were about 350 steam locomotives in the United States. An estimated 23 shops were engaged in their manufacture. With new facilities covering 4 blocks on a frontage of 1,125 feet, the Baldwin Locomotive Works of Philadelphia was the largest. Since at least 78 engines are known to have been imported from England by this time, Baldwin was responsible for just under half of the domestic production of railroad locomotives. The demand for motive power on the host of lines springing up throughout the country is reflected by the record of prices charged for Baldwin's machines. His third engine, the Lancaster, represented considerable technological advantage over old Ironsides, and its price of $5,850 was nearly a 50% increase. From late 1834 until early 1836, the figure ranged between $6,317 and $6,400. But at the end of this interval, there were some difficulties with the workmen regarding wages. On March 8th, Baldwin was quoting a price of $6,700. On March 12th, there was a meeting of his employees, quote, whose object was to have a turnout, end quote. And by the 24th engine, Matthias Baldwin was informing a buyer that, quote, owing to the rise of wages with my workmen and the still increasing price of materials, and not knowing when it may stop or where it will end, I am induced to ask $7,000 for my machines, end quote. Having recognized the value of their skills, Baldwin's 240 mechanics and artisans had exerted their leverage. With the growing demand for locomotives, their employer could well afford to pass additional labor costs on to the railroads. So until February of 1837, Baldwin was usually able to stabilize his price at $7,000, although iron, which he had formerly obtained at $160 a ton, had now climbed to $240 a ton. Other materials had also risen at about the same proportion. Of the 14 locomotives built for the State Road during 1837, the first 3 each cost $7,000. The remaining 11, delivered after February 18th, were priced at $7,500. In spite of all that had happened to the economy and to the banking situation in the meantime, the Philadelphia and Columbia continued to pay $7,500 apiece for 2 additional engines furnished in April 1839. But by then, the procrastination of debtors, both public and private, had become widespread. Building an engine under contract was one matter. Extracting payment upon delivery was another. Now, when you think of a massive manufactory like Baldwin Locomotives, you probably conjure up a Ford-type assembly line, which was still many, many decades away. But don't forget, Henry Ford made identical Model Ts. They were all painted the same color. They were virtually indistinguishable from one another. Frederick Winslow Taylor, the father of scientific management, buried at Laurel Hill West, would have torn out his hair in frustration at Baldwin, because Taylor believed there was one and only one proper way to perform a task, and the problem is that not all railroad locomotives are alike. It was in the 1850s that railway master mechanics began to exert primary influence over locomotive design, mandating their preference in specifications or complete engine plans. Since the master mechanics of different roads tended to have unique desires, Baldwin had to build an increasingly diverse range of locomotive types, particularly after the Civil War. In 1876, the firm reported that it had drawings on file for more than 300 different engine designs. By 1884, that number had reached 600. As this increase indicates, much of Baldwin's success in the locomotive industry arose from its willingness and ability to fulfill the railroad's varied specifications. To give one example, in a single year, 1890, the firm made 946 engines to 316 different designs. That's why Ford's assembly line would not work for Baldwin. Now, the notion that the American standard gauge, 4 feet 8.5 inches, traces its origins back to the width of Roman roads is a popular and enduring legend. But it really is more myth than historical fact. You may have heard the story that the gauge of railroad tracks was determined by the width of ancient Roman chariots, whose ruts dictated the spacing of wheels for centuries and ultimately influenced railroad designs. Now, it is true that early British railway engineers designed tracks to accommodate the wheel spacing of horse-drawn wagons common at the time. There is no direct evidence that designers consciously copied Roman measurements. The United States did not adopt this standard gauge, 4 feet 8.5 inches, until 1886. So for the first half century of Baldwin's factory, his engines had to be made to specification and speculation. Baldwin was elected to the board of directors of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts in 1852. He also joined a lot of other civic organizations. I won't list them here. In the summer of 1860, Matthias Baldwin took his one and only pleasure trip. He traveled across Great Britain and Europe, and he was fascinated by advances in machinery and science, but he intentionally set aside business and immersed himself in the art and culture of the old world. And when he returned, the country was in turmoil. Politics were heated like never before. Baldwin started his own business just as the Missouri Compromise made slavery the central issue in American politics. He finished his first locomotive while the threat of disunion loomed in South Carolina. And as he worked on improved engines, he was called to vote on the same issue in the state's constitutional convention. Through 40 years, Baldwin never wavered in his beliefs. Baldwin wasn't one to loudly proclaim his views. He let his actions speak. Popularity or self-interest never swayed him. A competitor sent secret letters throughout the South that labeled Baldwin as a radical abolitionist, and this upset his Southern clients. Baldwin responded firmly, saying political opinions have no place in business unless his work failed to meet expectations. Yet he was clear about his moral beliefs. Ironically, he lost Southern orders, which might have actually saved him from financial ruin, as the South rebelled and his rival's plot backfired. It's conceivable that as the South broke away, a lot of Baldwin locomotives would be sitting partially completed and totally unpaid for. Now, the Civil War gave Baldwin a chance to express his convictions even more openly. He received harsh letters from Southern relatives about his anti-slavery views, but he replied with spirited predictions of their ultimate victory. Though these letters are lost, they would have been invaluable. Sometimes his passion for the cause overcame his reluctance to take the spotlight. Baldwin agreed to lead patriotic gatherings, including one that honored Robert Smalls, the brave black sailor who piloted the steamer Planter out of Charleston. He introduced Smalls as, quote, one worthy to be an admiral, end quote. But when Philadelphia disgracefully barred Smalls from public transportation because of his race, Baldwin chaired another meeting to protest and assert equal rights. He lived to see the principles he defended upheld in court, and he lived long enough to see public transportation integrated in Philadelphia because of his work. Years earlier, Baldwin had hired a black worker in the boiler shop. The foreman objected, demanding the man's dismissal. Baldwin said he'd fired him if he wasn't competent. The foreman admitted the worker was good, but insisted he leave because of his race. Baldwin told the foreman, no, you leave instead, and the black worker stayed until his death. Baldwin deeply admired soldiers defending both his country and his principles. He always encouraged them and supported efforts for their comfort and spiritual well-being. His company donated large sums to organizations like the United States Sanitary and Christian Commissions to help soldiers and their families. Baldwin was an early active member of the Sanitary Commission, which revolutionized care for wounded soldiers. He attended the first meeting in Philadelphia in November 1861, and he served faithfully on its executive committee until his death. For more on the Great Sanitary Fair, listen to All Bones Considered, Laurel Hill Stories number 60, Part 2, on Elizabeth Duane Gillespie. In February 1865, when the pastor of Calvary Church wanted to leave to minister to soldiers, Baldwin quickly proposed granting his leave, saying pastors could do more good in the field. And that evening, though Baldwin could not attend, he gave a personal donation of $1,000 for the cause. His compassion extended to judging soldiers' faults. As a city prison inspector, he often showed leniency, especially to veterans, and encouraged them to stay out of trouble. Baldwin lived simply, resisting suggestions to upgrade his home even after he achieved business success. He saw personal debt as risky, but he didn't hesitate to borrow for charity. Curtailing his giving pained him more than anything else. And when he finally moved in 1864, he bought a modest brick building on busy Chestnut Street, not a grand mansion on North Broad or Rittenhouse Square. He wanted to stay close to people, saying he lived for their good and wanted to share his enjoyment of art and nature. As a journeyman, Baldwin had loved viewing prints and paintings displayed for the public. He resolved that if he ever owned art or beautiful things, he'd let others enjoy them too. He fulfilled this dream, opening his house for musical evenings and art viewings. His conservatory of rare flowers was visible from the street, delighted crowds daily. The joy that he brought others was his greatest reward. Baldwin wanted people to experience spiritual blessings as well. His religious passion was quiet but strong, and near the end of his life, he became even more eager to see people turn to faith. He welcomed children into the church, believing they belonged there as much as adults, and encouraged their spiritual growth. His last days were filled with acts of kindness, tireless work, and unwavering faith. In April 1866, he urged the church toward greater generosity and a more spiritual outlook. Baldwin's health declined rapidly. He openly discussed his readiness for death, accepting that his work would soon continue without him. Yet he carried on, listening to requests for charity and increasing his donations, including doubling his annual gift to the American Board of Commissioners for Foreign Missions. In June 1866, he walked slowly to his office, struggling with pain. Charitable work was his only comfort. That afternoon, he left his workplace for the last time, returned home to Wissinoming, where he passed away. In the funeral procession, city dignitaries stood shoulder to shoulder with 1,000 workers. They proceeded on foot from Center City to Laurel Hill Cemetery, a few miles up the Ridge Pike. Baldwin was buried in a large plot on what is now called Millionaire's Row. His neighbors include the saw magnate Henry Diston, the sugar king William Harrison, traction baron Robert Carson. His obelisk is not pointed at the top. It's crowned by a globe. And if you look carefully, you'll see that the globe is encircled by railroad tracks. At the time of its founder's death, the Baldwin Locomotive Works had produced some 1,500 steam locomotives. Matthew Baird, who's buried in Section K, took over as next president. Baird's brother was famed marble worker John Baird. He's the man responsible for the Yellow Fever Monument at Laurel Hill East. The Baldwin Company ultimately produced a total of some 75,000 steam locomotive engines before it terminated production in 1956. How big a deal was Baldwin's company? It was huge. In his book, The Baldwin Locomotive Works 1831-1915, business historian John K. Jack Brown described what a workday was like. I contacted him by email, and he gave me permission to quote extensively from the preface of his 1995 book. Just before the starting whistles blow out at 7 a.m., Baldwin's day shift of over 10,000 men hurries through the teeming streets of Bush Hill, an industrial district rendered in brick and soot, crowded with factories, railway lines, coal yards, and worker tenements. The men split up into separate groups, heading for the different shops of a factory spread out over 12 city blocks, where the 6,000 workers of the night shift are ready to lay down their tools. Upon arriving, the daymen will begin work on any of the approximately 450 new locomotives that on this morning are at varying stages of completion in Baldwin's regular production schedule. From the foundries to the erecting shop, workers in 8 skilled trades and scores of specialties apply their talents to engines ranging from little 4-ton electrics to massive 150-ton steamers. Baldwin did not make a single standard steam locomotive, but it largely followed common steps in building these custom products. It all begins in the drawing room. Actually, 2 large floors of the office building at Broad and Spring Garden Streets, where 150 draftsmen work up new designs. Under Baldwin's 8-week production schedule, the draftsmen have 3 weeks on average to get out the plans for a new type of engine, and much of the firm's output at this time was custom designs. Referring to the contract specifications, they build a locomotive on paper, using established standard parts where possible and drawing new component designs as needed. After plans are drawn and checked, they first go to the purchasing department, which orders materials from outside vendors. Great quantities of costly semi-finished materials like boiler flues, steel tires, forged axles, and patented appliances come from specialist firms, the expense reaching more than 50% of the final price of a Baldwin engine. On this morning, many orders have advanced to weeks 4 and 5 in the production schedule. This fortnight sees the receipt of material from outside makers and the first work inside the factory. Highly skilled blacksmiths in the smith shops sweltered despite the cool autumn weather, forging iron and steel parts ranging from leaf springs to engine frames. Individual smiths work up springs and 100 other small parts on their own anvils, judging how far and fast to work the glowing plastic iron before returning it to the fire. Large pieces like a locomotive frame require a crew of 4 or 5, using a jib crane swing the work from the fire to the massive steam hammer needed for large forging jobs. While the smiths test their skills against iron in a pitched battle of ringing hammer blows, raging heat, and choking smoke, skilled molders and their assistants in the foundry begin making sand molds for cylinders, wheel centers, and other castings, using wooden patterns made up by the pattern makers. With this painstaking work underway, the foundry cupolas are charged with coke fuel and pig iron. By mid-afternoon, the molten iron is ready for pouring. A single-cylinder casting can require over 10,000 pounds of the bubbling liquid. The founders judge when the heat is right for the pour by eyeing the iron's brilliant glow in the ladle. We leave the foundry behind for our next stop in the boiler shop, although much of the heat and the smell of liquid iron accompany us. Crowded conditions have forced Baldwin to place one of its boiler shops on a floor above the iron foundry. Boiler making has the potential to be a real bottleneck in the production schedule. All parts entering into a boiler come from outside suppliers, so most of the steel plates, fluids, stables, piping, gauges, and insulation do not arrive at Baldwin until the 5th week of the production schedule. The firm allows weeks 5 and 6 to the massively labor-intensive process of fabricating boilers, which could reach 40 feet in length and weigh up to 43,000 pounds even before the flues are added. To make each boiler in this 2 weeks, Baldwin allots 4 shops and over 3,000 men on 2 shifts to the task. They employ powered tooling whenever possible. Plate planers, drillers, punchers, rollers that accommodate sheets over 20 feet long, as well as overhead cranes, hydraulic presses, and power riveters. Notwithstanding these tools, the work remains notably labor-intensive, and the firm must rigorously subdivide tasks to stay on schedule. Each stage has its own specialist: markers, drillers, rollers, flangers, riveters, chippers, and caulkers, many requiring helpers. Working in small groups that are paid piecework rates, the men hurry from plate to plate and machine to machine. The work is rushed, but cannot be slapdash. Boilers under pressure are notoriously lethal, and Baldwin's customers often send inspectors into the plant to ensure that construction of their orders complies with railroad standards. The boiler shops are not as noisy as one would think. Huge hydraulic presses do most of the flanging work, making steam domes, for instance, while much of the riveting is accomplished by large hydraulic riveters rather than the brute force hammering of the past period. While the Boilermakers shear, roll, punch, flange, press, and rivet steel sheets as if they were paper, over 5,000 machinists turn to precision machining operations. Baldwin's machine shops are scattered across 7 city blocks, with the 2 major shops on Broad Street occupying 4- and 6-story buildings. Since the machinists must await the products of the foundries and smith shops, today they are working on orders in week 6 and 7 of the production schedule. Machining work runs the gamut, from crank pins the size of a forearm to driving wheels 6.5 feet in diameter to 5-ton cylinder castings. Most of the workers run machine tools driven by electric motors and use the new high-speed steel cutting tools. But operations like the final fitting of cylinder heads and journal bearings still call for the old ways: a fine file, a scraper, and practiced eyes and hands. In both hand and machine work, the men must utilize official fixtures, jigs, and templates that, when used with care, help ensure that parts are made with sufficient precision to be interchangeable among all engines in a batch order. Railroad inspectors are also intrusive in the machining departments, checking that Baldwin's work meets the railroad standards of precision. The machinists generally labor alone, although they need the help of crane operators and laborers to set up cylinders for boring or engine frames for planing. Here, too, the work is paid by the piece and highly specialized, but it calls for fine skill and judgment to bore a 10,000-pound cylinder casting on a true axis and to the correct diameters. A machinist error at this point could ruin the casting, already the product of countless hours of labor by pattern makers, founders, and casting cleaners. The work of draftsmen, pattern makers, founders, blacksmiths, boiler makers, pipe fitters, and machinists all converges in the erecting shop, a single room filling most of a city block on Broad Street, only a short distance from City Hall in the heart of downtown Philadelphia. Erecting occupies the 8th week in the production schedule. Today the shop is filled to its capacity of 75 engines. In previous decades, this final stage of construction had been a notable bottleneck to improving output. But now frames and other machine parts are made with sufficient precision to come together with only minimal fitting, while electric overhead cranes speed the handling of large parts like boilers. Today, the army of 3,200 workers in the erecting shop requires only a week on average to complete a locomotive. While all the men here are involved in erecting, a great range of skills and tasks come under that heading. Most are machinists and fitters, but large numbers of boiler makers, pipe fitters, insulation men, sheet metal workers, painters, and laborers also work in this shop. Most visitors to the erecting shop find it a confusing bedlam of parts and men, a chaos of designs and various designs of completion. The first stage in erecting generally involves setting up the cylinders, precisely aligning the bare machine frames on jacks, and bolting the cylinders to the frames. Next, a flat car arrives from the boiler shop across Buttonwood Street, carrying a boiler that the 100-ton overhead cranes silently places on its frames. Knots of busy men then descend upon the developing engine, each group specializing in a different task, proceeding quickly from one locomotive to the next. While erectors bolt the boiler to the cylinder saddle, boilermakers place hundreds of flues inside the boiler's shell, each tube requiring 10 separate steps to make a tight joint in the flue sheets. Then the engine is plucked off its jacks by an overhead crane and placed on its driving wheels, which have been laid out on an adjacent track. Now it looks like a real locomotive, and the pace of construction increases. Specialist gangs drill, tap, and mount the remaining boiler fittings. The boiler is tested with hot water at 200 pounds per square inch. Boilermakers caulk leaky flues and fittings, and the engine is prepared for a live steam test. The most skilled machinists in the shop set up the connecting rods, reversing gear, and valve motion. The bearings of these moving parts must be precisely aligned, so the machinists make final adjustments with files and scrapers. Other workers cover the boiler with its magnesia insulation and the sheet steel jacketing that protects the lagging, and a crane operator lowers the complete painted cab onto the engine. The locomotive is filled with 180 pounds steam from a shop boiler, and a machinist cautiously opens the throttle. With the engine jacked up, the main drivers revolve in the air, showing that all is working properly. And after this crucial test, the remaining work is hurried forward. Erectors add the brakes, lubricators, air pump, injectors, handrails, cab fittings, running boards, fire grates, ash pan, leading truck, and dozens of other parts. The engine is nearly finished, and the overhead crane places it on the ready track leading out of the building. A shop switcher will soon haul the new locomotive uptown on the tracks of the Philadelphia and Reading to Baldwin's finishing shop at 26th Street. There it will join its tender from the 17th Street shops. Painters will finish lettering in the details, and a Baldwin delivery engineer will take charge of the new locomotive under his care, and it will travel across the country to its purchaser. In a mere 8 weeks, Baldwin's thousands of workers took a novel design and translated it from words on a specification sheet into drawing, and then into a finished mechanism in steel and iron weighing upwards of 150 tons and capable of hauling 6,000-ton trains. While customers around the globe order uniquely different locomotives, the methods used in production reduce the constant variety and potential chaos to routine and order. During the month of our imaginary visit, October 1905, more than 7 engines rolled from the erecting shop every working day. And for the year, as a whole, Baldwin built 2,250 locomotives in hundreds of designs for customers around the nation and around the world. People of the 19th century had a passionate faith in this technology that conquered time, tamed vast distances, and tapped the wealth of continents. To modernize theirs was a naively romantic view, but the facts suggest how it originated. Baldwin engines climbed Pikes Peak and hauled the Trans-Siberian Express. They roamed the American West on the nation's 5 major transcontinental lines. A Baldwin took the first train of the Jaffa and Jerusalem Railroad into Jerusalem, while others ran in England, birthplace of the railway age. They also played supporting roles in life's human dramas. In 1865, a Baldwin engine, decked in black mourning crepe, pulled the train carrying the body of the murdered Lincoln westward toward Springfield. 40 years later, a wealthy California eccentric and former gold miner, Death Valley Scotty, paid the Santa Fe to carry him on a record-breaking 45-hour dash from Los Angeles to Chicago. Like Pony Express relays, a succession of 19 engines, 17 built by Baldwin, propelled the old prospector's Special Express at lightning speed across the continent, while the nation's newspapers chronicled the feat. Partly because of such incidents, a highly romantic symbolic burden has attached itself to the steam locomotive from its origins to the present. Of all the icons of 19th century technology, this machine has exerted the most enduring fascination. The subject of Whitman's poetry, Hawthorne's prose, for artists from George Inness to Charles Sheeler, endlessly recorded in thousands of photographs. Steam locomotives still hauled an infinite freight of mental imagery as totems of power, the speed, as noble animated iron steed, and as evocations of a mythic national past of confidence and simplicity when every boy dreamed of being an engineer. Professor John K. Brown, Jack, thank you for letting me read that from your book from 30 years ago. As you said in your email, I was the first person who actually asked permission to use it. And then you said that you know other people have read it because you've read your work in other people's works. So happy to do that. That's the least I can do. If I use a contemporary reference, I do try to get in touch with the person who wrote it. Your best place to examine a massive Baldwin locomotive is the Franklin Institute. The Baldwin 60,000. It was built in 1926. In 1933, after it was shown around the country, and it was converted to oil and then back to coal, the locomotive was moved over a 5-day period from the Baltimore and Ohio Railroad tracks, the B&O, at 24th and Vine, over temporary tracks to the new museum that was being built there on the Parkway. The locomotive was placed in the building through the opening in the western wall before the building was completed, so that 350-ton marvel has been there ever since, fascinating visitors of all ages from everywhere. In 1903, the city approved a bill that permitted the Fairmount Park Art Association to place a statue of Matthias Baldwin near Spring Garden and Broad Street, gifted by Burnham Williams and Company, operators of Baldwin Locomotive Works. New York sculptor Herbert Adams designed the statue, completed in 1905, installed in April 1906. The dedication ceremony took place June 2, 1906, with speeches by Mayor Weaver, and hundreds of people showed up, and the event was commemorated with a pamphlet, a 20-page pamphlet, including photos and transcripts. Well, the statue was moved to the northeast corner of City Hall in 1921, and then it was moved again in 1936 to where you find it now, City Hall's North Plaza. In June of 2020, amid Black Lives Matter protests, it was disfigured with paint and graffiti, alongside other public artworks. Protesters had assumed that since Matthias Baldwin was a 19th century white man, he somehow must have approved of slavery. He was tagged as a murderer and a colonizer. Obviously, the protesters had absolutely no idea of Baldwin's advocacy for African American civil rights, something that he believed in very firmly and fought for. Matthias Baldwin Park, a 2-acre garden spot in the 400 block of North 19th Street, was named for this pioneering manufacturer in 2011. Before that, this area had been part of a parcel intended to be a city within a city called Franklin Town. Baldwin Park is nestled about, I'm going to say, midway between Philadelphia Community College and the Barnes Foundation. If you walk from one to the other, you're going to go right through Baldwin Park. Now, don't confuse Franklin Town with Francisville, like I do sometimes. The latter is also a segment of North Philadelphia, but Francisville stretches from Fairmount Avenue to the south, Girard to the north, Broad to the east, and Corinthian to the west. It's named after colonial lawyer Tench Francis. This is an older, more residential, well-settled part of the city, lots of row homes. Franklin Town, on the other hand, several blocks west of that, it refers to the smaller area near the Vine Street Expressway. It is largely characterized by modern residential building. It used to be all industrial, but now it's modern residential buildings, planned developments, and proximity to major cultural attractions like the Pennsylvania Convention Center. So Franklin Town was actually envisioned in the late 20th century as a redevelopment project. So its layout and amenities differ from the traditional organic feel of Francisville. If you want more information on Matthias Baldwin and the Baldwin Locomotive Works, I recommend the detailed work done by the Friends of Matthias Baldwin Park at their website, baldwinparkphilly.org. Put in a / and history. They have dredged up details on dozens of people who worked and lived in that neighborhood before eminent domain came and took their abodes. There are several historical essays on that site that are just such a treat to read for the history buff like me, and probably like you. So I suggest you pay them a visit, baldwinparkphilly.org / history.